Ventriloquism has always seemed like an eerie concept for many of us, dating back to the 16th century when Louis Brabant was practicing this art medium by speaking from his stomach to King Francis I. During this time period, dolls weren't a factor, and ventriloquists, back then called gastrophils, were believed to have demons speaking from their stomachs as a way to speak to deceased ones. This stigma remained for the next few centuries, and so practitioners were accused of witchcraft. When dolls were actually introduced, this only made the hobby look like a nightmare fuel. Although it became a very stable and successful career path for many, others were still skeptic of these performances. Thus the introduction of this 1964 film, Devil Doll. The movie begins with our main antagonist, the Great Vorelli, played by Brian Halliday, a very prevalent actor in today's times. He also kind of looks like Abraham Lincoln, but that's a side tangent. Anyways, he's on his way to perform his next show as a famous ventriloquist. Arriving to the backstage, we hear Vorelli speak to his doll named Hugo, something that doesn't make sense to any of us until later on in the film.
You'll never win. You'll always lose.
We get to meet this guy named Mark English, who's a journalist, don't gotta tell me twice, who was assigned to write a report on the Great Vorelli. However, he quickly runs into some trouble when his assistant reports to him that the volunteer they had for the show had backed out, claiming that she was afraid of being mind-controlled by Vorelli. Again, no clue as to what she meant by this until later on in the film. So Mark is quick to dial someone else to volunteer, and I'm just saying that if he picked a man, this whole film could have probably been avoided. Unless Vorelli swings that way, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We learn the woman's name is Marianne, and the movie cuts to the anticipated performance. The show begins by having Vorelli hypnotizing an audience member, making him believe his life is at the verge of death with words and scenarios. Or maybe it was just that creepy look in his eyes, I don't know.
Mr. Harris?
This guy seems to have experienced some trauma after taking a trip to China and watching someone get murdered on the spot. I have no clue as to why this person would just randomly open up to this guy in front of an audience, but regardless, Vorelli seemed to have no problem exploiting the situation for capital, making the guy put himself in the victim's shoes, resulting in panic and likely PTSD, but who cares, the audience is eating that shit up. Anyways, the time comes when Vorelli needs another volunteer, and although hesitant at first, Marianne stays true to her promise. She, on the other hand, had it a lot easier than Mr. China over here, since Vorelli's hypnosis made Marianne pull some devious late 1900 dance moves. After snapping back to reality, Marianne seemed confused and disturbed by the fact that she couldn't recall a thing. But this is when things start getting interesting, as Vorelli pulls out his dummy Hugo and begins his ventriloquist act. This first performance consists of Vorelli drinking wine while speaking as Hugo pretending to want some. Despite the impressive act, something just feels off about the guy. The way he speaks to Hugo sounds aggressive and mean-spirited. I mean, just listen to his tone of voice when he says this.
Give it to me. I know what wine is. I've had wine before. I want some wine. Why shouldn't I have some wine?
You are a dummy, Hugo.
The second act is where I truly lost my shit. Vorelli tells Hugo to walk up to the stage and thank the audience. The audience seemed just as confused as I was, but silence arose when the fucking dummy actually stood up and thanked them. However, this has to be the most neurologically deficit crowd I've ever seen, since the response they gave back was yet another applause. Like, this is not 2024. A flexible dummy is not going to have mechanical functions. So after the whole performance, we get to see Vorelli find interest in Marianne. Apparently, she's well known for being one of the richest girls in England, and somehow he conveniently knows her aunt. Knowing that she has an event coming up, that being a charity ball, he plots to make himself known and offer his services to Marianne. Definitely for no malicious intent whatsoever. Nope, not a single one. On the car ride back with Mark Espanol and Marianne, she begins to hear voices calling her name. More specifically, she hears Vorelli echoing through her head. After Mark reassures her that nobody said a word, everything quickly goes back to normal. I'm sure she's not the only one fighting demons up there. So ironically enough, Mark actually wants Vorelli to come to the charity ball to examine Hugo for potentially a new report. He asks Marianne to invite him over so he can get a better look. And then they make out for a minute straight on camera. After Vorelli finally gets in a room with her to discuss the idea, oh wow, would you look at that, they're in sync.
You mean you will come?
If you want me.
Oh, indeed we do.
He could have ended things there, but Vorelli, being the absolute Riz god he is, he serves Marianne some wine from Sicily, an attempt to start a conversation. He actually seems like quite the gentleman. I hope he doesn't try to hypnotize her with a no! Ball comes around and Marianne can't help but to feel uneasy about the whole situation. Yep, she's still hearing Vorelli's voice inside her head. When it's time for him to perform, he demands Hugo to sing a song for everybody. Having refused the request prompted Vorelli to grab a little munchie from the snack bar as he patiently waits for a change of heart. But the only thing that changed was Hugo's appetite, as now he wanted a snack too.
Don't I get anything to eat? I'm hungry.
Whoever heard of a ventriloquist dummy eating?
So Vorelli once again told him to stand up and grab it himself. And boy, let me tell you, I thought we were getting the Chucky origin story here with how close of a call this actually was. Hugo attempts to grab the knife in betrayal of Vorelli, but quickly succumbs when he's reminded of his master. For me personally, this has to be one of my favorite scenes from the movie, since we can really see that Hugo has a lot more to him than we may think. The tension built up in suspense of the scene was actually very well executed, so well done, clap it up. Of course, everyone in the audience thinks this is part of the act, and things continue as planned. Mark goes inside the room where Hugo lies within a cage, standing there menacingly. He touches the dummy without consent and finds out that he's actually not mechanical. Ooh, spooky. In a different room, we see Vorelli hypnotizing Marianne once again, persuading her to come see him when he calls.
Wherever you are, you will come. But until I call, you will be yourself.
Later that night, we see Vorelli lying in bed, and he proceeds to send out a message to Marianne in her dreams, not allowing this poor woman to even get some good night's sleep. Eventually, still being hypnotized, she comes over to Vorelli's guest room, and he ends up doing something extremely gross. I'm sure you get the memo, but if you don't, just remember the word consent. Meanwhile, all of this goes down. Hugo decides to pay our friend Mark a visit. He warns Mark in a very cryptic way, and if I'm correct, I believe this is also the first time we hear Hugo speak. So I got copyrighted for trying to play this clip. All Hugo said was, "Hey yo, Mark, please catch me in Berlin." You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to give you a clue here. But that's about it. Now, any regular sane person would simply pack their bags and never look back. But for Mark, his journalism senses were tingling. He wakes up the next day, smoking a cigarette, and questioning his life choices. After his assistant walks in, he attempts to explain to her what happened. But of course, she would disregard it by saying it was all a good old dream. Shortly after, Mark gets a call from one of his servants, I think. I don't know. He's rich, alright. They inform him that Marianne is still very sick and advise him to come see her. When he asks what's wrong, they fail to give a proper explanation, only demanding that he comes forward. And so 2 hours later, there he was, facing down at Marianne lying on her bed, sick, murmuring words until they found clarity.
Make him stop, Mom. Mom, make him stop.
Darling, what is it?
Despite the confusing situation, he was adamant about Vorelli being the sole cause for her illness. The family doctor he speaks to doesn't believe this, of course, and brushes it off as nonsense. During another one of Vorelli's performances, we had this pretty weird sequence that I can't quite show on YouTube. But pretty much Vorelli hypnotizes yet another girl on stage to dance and strip naked? This scene felt kind of unnecessary and filler, but if anybody wasn't paying attention before, they definitely are now. Fun fact, I also believe this scene was cut off from official streaming platforms since I was only able to find that on YouTube. Anyways, we cut back only to see Hugo catch one of the biggest strays of the 1900s.
Hugo, she said you were ugly.
This must have cut him pretty deep since shortly after some manipulation from Vorelli, Hugo uses a knife to interrupt some quality sleep. The victim in this case was Vorelli's wife, or assistant, I'm not really sure. But I never really cared about her, so it's a pretty mid-def. At this point, Mark has had enough. He decides to call for help on the investigation to find out every single detail about Vorelli's past. He suspects him as a terrible man and gets one of his acquaintances to conduct some research. Oh, and yeah, Marianne still feels like shit. Mark gets a phone call and apparently they've got a lead on the Vorelli case in Berlin. He books a flight there and meets up with his partner Garrett to investigate further. Meanwhile, Vorelli is busy perfecting his Marianne dummy that he made. I would act surprised, but I don't expect anything less from this man. Mark is now in Berlin and asks Garrett, his partner, what he's found on Vorelli so far. Turns out, Vorelli's been hyper-obsessing over this concept of man and soul separation for a really long time now. But before any of that hoopla, he was actually in med school, quote-unquote, practicing to be a doctor. I say that because he didn't use the degree after graduating and also got kicked out of the medical society for reasons we don't know. Surely it can't be a hard guess though. If you already thought his credibility was crumbling, his biography keeps expanding for the worst reasons. At one of his shows, I don't know if he spilled his coffee in the morning, but he he straight up stabbed one of his volunteers for shits and giggles. I guess he must have erased everybody's mind or something afterwards, because only a few people made it out remembering what happened. Now let's just pretend that that's how that works, and say that not a single authority found out he murdered this man. Not even the government that helps fund the theater. Nope, you're telling me his family and loved ones just said, "Oh, I wonder where Billy went." Like, okay, buddy. They're told this information by some coworker who happened to be a bystander during the situation. Or maybe more than that. We learned that this lady and a boy named Hugo were working for Vorelli under little pay. They had fun during set, so it wasn't much of a problem. Until Vorelli began hypnotizing the both of them to do things off stage. I guess that means Vorelli does in fact go both ways, so my argument earlier has been disputed. I'm tired of saying his name so much, so I'm just gonna call him Big V. Big V unboxes an identical looking dummy to Hugo, probably ordered off Amazon, and says something that probably should have been his cue to GTFO.
Oh, it looks like Hugo.
Yes, it could resemble me.
It will be.
We then see Big V doing some hocus pocus on Hugo, transferring his soul or something right before the big show. The lady stumbles upon this witchcraft and is told by Vorelli to leave immediately. He stabs Hugo right in the chest, and the audience screams in panic once they realize that the act wasn't staged. The cutaway was kinda funny though, I'm not gonna lie. It just sounds like overused stock sounds ripped straight from Audio Jungle.
Audio Jungle.
After Mark and Garrett finish wrapping things up with the lady and his former janitor friend, who also happened to be a witness, they head back and Mark is pleased to be informed that Marianne is finally feeling better. It's not too long though before we see Big V being allowed inside her home to see her. After all this hypnosis madness, the woman finally gets better, and y'all let this man in. I can't make this shit up. I don't know who these guards are, but they're better off working as hall monitors. After this encounter between Marianne and Big V, we get another comical sequence where the person in charge of sound has no right to go this crazy, because what the fuck is this? Big V once again mind controls Marianne and tells her to let Mark know she wants that Big D. The joke is that he wants her to marry him. Once she meets up with him and explains her fake feelings, Mark is obviously confused by this sentiment and storms off without saying a single word back. Towards the end of the film, we see Big V explain his evil master plan to his dummy Hugo, plotting to marry Marianne, that's funny, in Spain, where he'll eventually take her life and inherit her money. Meanwhile, Mark is drinking his sorrows away at a bar. Big V unlocks Hugo's cage to punish him further for his as of late rebellious nature.
You've been in your little wooden body so long you've become an individual again. I think I must teach you a little lesson.
However, as he's about to do whatever he was gonna do, he gets interrupted by one of his workers, giving Hugo the chance to finally fight back. He saves Marianne by stomping on her wooden replica's face, disconnecting her soul from the dummy. Eventually, after some more back and forth, Hugo finally exchanges bodies with Big V, leaving him trapped there for the rest of time. Mark also comes in at the end to make his presence known.
Don't be alarmed, Mr. English. Vorelli is now in the wooden doll.
Get me out of here. I am the great Vorelli. He can't do this to me. Please, Mr. English, don't let him do it. I'll do anything you say.
But that's Devil Doll. If you want to experience a form of psychosis for yourself, there's a video on screen talking about a game that forces you to live in an alternate reality by facing an evil we all have, the mind. Thank you for watching. I know my nose might have been a little stuffy. I'm sick as of recording this. But if you enjoyed and you're a newcomer, please like and subscribe as I'm trying to grow this channel up to the moon.